So social trends are a thing. Whether it's collecting the latest useless collectible, or partaking in the how many dehydrated baby carrots can you shove into your butthole challenge, there's no avenue that humanity won't venture in order to fulfill our lives, with something to ooh and ah at. And it's been that way since the dawn of man. Segment 1. Flagpole/pole sitting. Syria, 5th century. USA, 1920s, 1970s. Take, for instance, flagpole sitting. It's exactly as boring as it sounds, but for the dopamine-deprived people of this was the bee's knees. The practice of posteriors, perpetually planted on pillars and poles, was prevalent as far back as the 5th century. Back then, a bunch of Christian dudes called stylites would make it their mission to live atop tall pillars, the term stylites deriving from the Greek stelos, quite literally meaning pillar or column. Now, this wasn't for social entertainment, but rather for the salvation of their soul. Perhaps history's most well-known stylite was Simeon the Stylite. He believed that by living all uncomfy and uncozy atop his tall little pillar palace in Syria with minimal sustenance and constant exposure to the elements, he would essentially cast away his mortal self. All that remains would be his immortal soul, ready for a first-class ticket to the heavens beyond. Because I guess God loves watching his creations mercilessly punish themselves for good boy points. According to some historical sources, Simeon remained perched on his pillar for as long as 42 years until his death. A real commitment to the bit. Fast forward tens of billions of seconds into the future. The practice of pole sitting made a comeback in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. Only this time it was to draw a crowd. Like any trend, it all began with one person, semi-professional stuntman Alvin Kelly. Reportedly the result of a friendly dare, Kelly's first publicized climb was in 1924, where he sat for several hours outside a department store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. "Excuse me, what's with that guy up there? Buy a coat. Buy some slacks. Don't forget to buy a hat. He's no one. Welcome to the story. Enjoy yourself. Hey, come on. Get down. From there. I'm not going to ask again. What are you going to do? Come up here and make me? Yeah, that's what I thought." Kelly's successful marketing campaign actually bloomed into a career. He would use his questionable talent to promote things like movie premieres or sporting events, but eventually became the main spectacle himself, touring 28 cities across the country where people actually bought tickets to watch a dude sit atop a pole for hours on end. Do a flip. His personal best was a cheek-numbing 49 days in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All of this fame and attention paved the way for others to take up the trend, from amateur backyard enthusiasts to full-time professional pole sitters. But of course, nothing lasts forever. The fad began dying out once several people started to die off thanks to that great big depression that happened in the 1930s. It's hard to laugh at someone struggling and starving on a pole 200 feet in the air when you're struggling and starving at ground level. By its very nature, the stunt of pole sitting was extremely dangerous. You had to balance yourself properly through sleep deprivation, harsh weather, and lack of nutrition. One slippery overcorrection was enough to convert all of your potential energy into kinetic energy as you gave onlookers a direct demonstration of gravitational acceleration. Well, there he goes. There was at least one verifiable death directly related to the act. Granted, this was decades later in the 1970s. The unlucky fellow who took the fall was 72-year-old professional poler Richard Blandy. Dear old Dick spent a record-breaking 125 days atop a pole in Stockholm, Sweden just 9 years prior, surviving mostly on whiskey and 3 packs of cigarettes a day, or as I like to call it, the stepdad special. Then things hit a wall for Richard, or in this case, the ground. In 1974, while finishing up a 4-day promotional sitting at Dixie Square Mall in Harvey, Illinois, a trailer accidentally reversed into his tower, causing it to collapse and Richard to plummet to his death. Remember, the higher the heights you reach, the longer the fall from the top. Segment 2, Venetian Ceruse. Lead-based makeup. Ancient Egypt, Renaissance Europe, England, 1760. Despite the fancy-sounding name, you're probably familiar with this one. Venetian ceruse was a specific type of cosmetic concoction used throughout the 16th century in Europe. The main purpose of this product was to lighten the complexion of many a fine fella or fellat. It also served to cover up blemishes and give a refined, flawless look. Believe it or not, the desire to appear pale as paste actually stretches as far back as 2000 BC with the ancient Egyptians. Well, the rich ones anyway. You see, getting all tanned and toned under the hot sun all day was a sign that you were a filthy hard-working, poor, not wanting to look like they partook in any labor. Egyptian nobles slapped lead-based powder all over their faces to get that DoorDash enthusiast look. You know, the look of royalty. The desire for a paler complexion traveled across the Mediterranean into ancient Greek territory, where again upper-class folks took it upon themselves to whiten their skin and cover up any skin imperfections. The trend continued on to influence ancient Rome and even ancient China, all of which stuck to the lead-based recipe. Jump into the futuristic years of the 16th century and the beauty standard still remained, and that's about the time that Venetian ceruse entered the fray. Perhaps one of the most notable historical figures that dabbled in the dust was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The exact cause of her death is debated, but historians speculate her kicking of the royal bucket to have been a severe blood infection brought on by heavy use of her lead-based Venetian ceruse makeup. She not only used the powder to minimize any melanistic manifestations, but to cover up severe scarring from her smallpox. It was also just the fashion at the time. If you take a look at a lot of Renaissance paintings from the era, you're going to see a lot of disturbingly white faces. It was the epitome of beauty. The most well-documented death directly from Venetian ceruse was debatably beautiful. Babe Countess Maria Coventry. Her heavy use of the stuff caused her own skin to crack and peel, forming painful open sores that she just covered up with more makeup. She bit the dust in 1760 at the age of just 27. So what exactly was it made of? And why was it so toxic? Well, first of all, it's lead. Lead is not good for you, especially not being plastered onto your skin for hours or days on end. But lead isn't even white. I hear you screaming at your screen. But white lead is. This is hydrocerussite, a lead salt compound, also called lead carbonate. Hydroxide. It's naturally occurring, usually found alongside pure lead deposits. Some Venetian fellas in Venice decided to mine the stuff, mash it up, and mix it with water and vinegar to create a paste. It was found to have incredible drying properties, so it was actually first used in the 16th century as a medical product, being applied to oozing open sores and wounds to suck up the juices. But then someone got a little experimental and realized it could be a great cosmetic as well. The problem with long-term lead exposure is that it leaches through the skin and into your blood, causing lead poisoning. And any condition with the word poisoning in it naturally doesn't have pretty side effects. According to the World Health Organization, severe lead poisoning can cause a wide variety of symptoms, none of them pleasant. You have your basic nausea and vomiting, sure, but you also have crippling headaches, memory loss, the big sad, and even high blood pressure in the short term. As for the long term, we're talking reproductive issues and even permanent brain and nervous system damage. The neurological effects often led to increased aggression, hyperactivity, and the lowering of one's IQ. So, in scientific conclusion, heavy lead makeup was creating a bunch of irritated, angry, infertile morons. Just like those, insert political party here. Am I right? Segment 3: Dance Marathons. United Kingdom, USA, 1923 to 1930s. Humans have been nodding their noggins and tapping their toes ever since first discovering a beat, and the act of rocking out usually lasts for several songs, which is normal. But how would you feel about dancing for days on end? Well, it happened. Dance marathons were all the rage back in the 1920s in the United States, but Americans actually have the British to thank for that. In February of 1923, professional dance couple Ali and Edgar took it upon themselves to cut a British rug for 7 hours straight. This was something that, historically speaking, had never really been done before, and it caught some national attention. But in true American fashion, the British were about to be one-upped. Alma Cummings, a New York dance instructor who became fascinated with the idea of testing human limits while revolutionizing human expression, set a blistering 27-hour dance record just 12 days after the Brits tried to be good at something. She put holes in her soles for God's sake. Something was happening within the United States in the 1920s. If you recall, the flagpole sitting craze was also hitting its stride at this point in time. Americans became obsessed with record-breaking feats of human physical endurance. So publicity stunts became the norm as normal humans tried pulling off superhuman endeavors. After Alma busted her move, the idea of endurance dancing began to take off. Within the next few weeks, her record had been broken 9 times across the country. So everyone was getting into the swing of things. It became a public spectacle with promoters hosting dancing marathons as a form of entertainment. Pay a 25-cent fee and you could just watch people shimmy, shimmy, shimmy to the break of dawn. Several dawns, actually. It didn't take long for the craze to drop a ranked mode. Competitive dancing marathons saw couples boogieing for days on end to get a chance at solid cash prizes. Those prizes became even more valuable once the world entered the Great Depression in the 1930s. In a collapsed economy, these marathons were seen not only as a form of entertainment for the now destitute masses, but a means of survival. That's because participants were properly fed and sheltered in exchange for their performance, all while still having that chance at a grand prize. These prizes could range from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000. Considering the median income in the 1930s was roughly $1,000 a year, this was a big deal. So dancing devolved from entertainment to desperation. Competitors were allowed only short breaks in between numbers to catch their breath, but they were still required to move and groove in some form, be it a tap of the foot or a nod of the head. Couples that stayed still for too long were actually prodded with sticks or splashed with water to get them back on their feet again, lest they be disqualified and thrown to the streets. The most famous dance champions of the age were handsome stud Muffin Callum Devil and beautiful babe Vonnie Kaczynski. So take a guess. How long do you think that their record-breaking dance lasted for? Time's up. The answer was a heel-evaporating 157 consecutive days, over 5 months of throwing down on the dance floor. Their prize $1,000, almost $25,000 in today's money. To no surprise, these endurance events were not without consequence. People fully exhausted themselves to the point of collapse. Staying in the contest meant that you had food, water, and shelter for as long as you kept shaking that thing. Unfortunately, this resulted in a few reported deaths across the nation. One of the first being 27-year-old Homer Morehouse. No, not this guy, just an amateur dancer. Homer had reportedly been throwing it back for 87 hours straight, suffering from malnutrition and extreme sleep deprivation. He stumbled to a chair to take a break and fell over dead. News of these deaths caused immediate nationwide banning of dance marathons when they realized that, albeit voluntary, human torture isn't all that humane. But when promoters were raking in tens of thousands of dollars per event, stacks of cold hard cash outweigh the stacks of cold hard bodies. Segment 4. Foot binding, Chanzu, Imperial China, 10th century to 1949. Hold on to your piggies, 'cause this one's going to cause some toes to curl. As a warning, there will be some gross feet pics somewhere in this section. Now, if you'll forgive my attempt at Chinese pronunciation, we'll get right into it. The practice of foot binding, or Chanzu, dates all the way back to the Imperial China days, with scholars failing to fully agree on any one origin story. Some claim the practice to have existed in the 6th century, but most point towards the 10th century. Under the Tang dynasty, it is believed that a concubine of unsurpassed beauty was the first to bind her feet, though of course not by choice. Lumpy Dumpling Emperor Liu commanded the aforementioned concubine Yaoyang to wrap her feet in white silk to resemble the crescent moon. She then performed a fancy dance atop a golden lotus statue. The emperor stood in awe at the grace and elegance of the woman's dance. So naturally, other women of status wanted to imitate it. Women would force their feet into unnatural positions with the goal of creating what were later referred to as lotus feet, like the flower, small, delicate, and beautiful. The teeny tiny tootsies were reportedly highly desirable, as Chinese men thought that this was undeniably sexy. Now, some historians believe that the real reason was a bit more selfish. The reality of it was that walking on permanently disfigured feet meant excruciating pain. This resulted in women walking very daintily and slow, if at all. It has been suggested that the act of binding, while convincing women that it was to attract suitable partners, was actually a form of control, with men limiting the mobility of their wives. This would, in a sense, bind them to their homes just as their feet were bound to their shoes. This forced these women into sedentary, boring lives with nothing more to do than menial labor such as weaving and tapestry to help with the household income. All right, but just how crunched in were those things? The answer is pretty freaking crunched. Ideally, the foot was to be no longer than 4 inches or 10 centimeters in length. Over the course of several months or even years, the toes would be repeatedly broken and tightly tucked under the sole, with the entire foot folded downward to achieve the desired effect. It's a sad reality that innumerable Chinese women faced across the centuries. And not just grown women, young girls too. I'm talking as young as just 4 or 5 years old. Got to fold and mold them feet while they're still growing. You ever go on the Living with the Land ride at Disney's Epcot and see the neat, Mickey-shaped pumpkins growing? It's the same principle, but with human feet. The binding of youthful feet was not only practical from a physical standpoint, but a disciplinary one as well. It trained young girls to realize that life is pain, as well as the importance of abiding by societal rules and customs. This practice persisted from the 10th century all the way up to the 19th century. By then, it's estimated that nearly half of all Chinese women had their feet bound to some degree. If it wasn't obvious, all that cracking and crunching of the feet didn't exactly come with health benefits. The forced deformation commonly resulted in ulcerations, nasty sores resulting from the cracking open of skin, which were very difficult to treat properly. These led to deadly bacterial infections and gangrene, sometimes requiring the full amputation of the affected foot. Refuse to cut off one foot and you can end up 6 feet underground. Foot binding started to fall out of favor towards the beginning of the 20th century. By this time, mass-produced textiles began taking over, leaving the perpetually work-from-home women to be out of a job. So they finally put their foot down. After exhaustive women's rights campaigns, the Chinese government took a step in the right direction by formally banning binding in 1949. Segment 5, Staged Train Crashes. American Plains, 1895 to 1930s. Now, when you've got something that's beyond repair, do you ever just make the decision to break it a bit more to give it that sense of finality? Maybe just chuck a busted light bulb into a garbage can to hear a satisfying shatter. Well, they did the same thing to full-size locomotives back in the day. Yep, if you had yourself a free afternoon and some spare change, you could waddle your britches on down to an isolated part of the plains to witness yourself a genuine high-speed train crash. But why? Because it looked cool. Come on. I know that when you cruise down the freeway and notice a wreck on the side of the road, you're going to be whipping your big dumb head around to see the extent of the damage. We all do it. That's why we have traffic. But that curiosity and wonder is what drew crowds of tens of thousands of spectators throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. The premise was simple. Beginning in 1895, railroad organizers figured out a way to profit off decommissioning their equipment. Train engines deemed obsolete either by being outdated or having otherwise unrepairable mechanical issues were placed on a long stretch of track facing each other. Onboard engineers would then set the locomotives full steam ahead before abandoning ship, allowing them to become a physical demonstration of physics. Spectators happily tossed a few of their hard-earned bucks to witness such a staged catastrophe. They were about as excited as a Second Amendment enthusiast experiencing his first home invasion. The problem, though, is that public safety measures at the time weren't much more than just standing back a ways while the trains did their thing. Nowadays, it's common for crowds to gather at scheduled demolition sites to watch tall buildings no longer be tall. But even at a bare minimum, safety nets are placed in front of crowds to catch any rogue debris. Think about it, even a small stone zooming through at hundreds of miles an hour can mean instant death. Well, that would have been a welcomed consideration in 1896. Just north of Waco, Texas, was the now infamous crash at Crush, a staged train wreck. That was more than what the crowd had bargained for. The planned crash was to occur at the town of Crush. Crash at Crush makes sense now. The temporary town was built specifically for the event with an expected crowd of 20,000 Texans. But thanks to effective advertising, 40,000 showed up, eagerly awaiting to see themselves a tasty train wreck. Now, this should have been an omen that things weren't going to go as planned. But double the crowd meant double the revenue, so the event stuck to schedule. The two trains were put in place and sent on their way, topping out at speeds of 50 miles per hour. The steam engines collided as expected, but upon impact, the boilers violently exploded. Not as expected. The explosion launched shrapnel in every direction, which naturally included where the crowd was standing. I don't think that was supposed to happen. You know what? I think you're right. In addition to dozens of Southern fellas sustaining some bumps and bruises from flying hunks of metal, at least 2 Texans unfortunately yeed their last haw. But surprisingly, the crowd didn't flee. Instead, they ran towards the wreckage to assess the damage and grabbed themselves a souvenir from the pile of twisted metal. After all, they did pay to see a wreck, so they were going to get their money's worth. Despite the widespread report of the tragedy, the public didn't seem to care. In fact, these stunts only got more and more popular. Events kept chugging along well into the 1930s when the trend finally crashed and burned.